Max Kesier. Welcome to On the Edge. Let's go to Shanghai and talk with Dan Collins of the China Money Report. Dan, welcome back to On the Edge.
Thanks, Max. Good to be back.
All right, Dan Collins, you recently wrote a piece on your blog called American GDP, the fantastic fiction of American economic strength. Let's start with GDP. Is the United States economy really larger than the world's second, third, and fourth largest economies combined?
Yeah, thanks, Max. Good question. Article I wrote, The Fantastic Fiction of American Economic Strength. I really put this out to put a focus on the GDP numbers. Most of American economic numbers, in my opinion, are almost nonsensical at this point. You know, we argue every day in the media, is unemployment 8.2% or is it 8.3%? Meanwhile, we have 90 million able-bodied adults we don't include in the workforce because they're not in the labor force. So most of the statistics have become completely nonsense. The GDP is what I think is one of the biggest ones. We're always focused on the GDP number. The whole focus behind the Keynesian economics is to push up the GDP number to give us so-called growth. And indeed, when you look at the GDP numbers, the United States last year, roughly a $14.5 trillion economy, is equal to the next three largest GDP numbers combined: Germany, China, and Japan. China is roughly a $6 trillion market, GDP, Japan $5 trillion, and Germany about $3.3 trillion. So I call these three countries the block of three, and then I compare really behind these GDP numbers, what's underneath it. What are these countries actually doing in terms of output? And I came up with some startling numbers, which anybody who's traveled in and around these countries realize this just doesn't make sense. First thing is you look at automotive production. The United States last year, with their $14.5 trillion GDP, produced 8.7 million cars. The block of three combined produced 33 million cars, over 4 times the number. You look at steel production. United States produced 85 million tons of steel last year. The block of three did 10 times that, 835 million tons of steel. You go through mobile users. They have 5 times the number of mobile users. So you have to start to ask yourself, what is bloating up this U.S. GDP number? And you look at the GDP equation, which is private consumption plus government spending plus gross investment minus exports and imports, the variance there. Well, obviously, if you look at the exports and the imports for the American economy, that's a negative on a U.S. GDP number. We only export about $1.4 trillion worth of goods. And most of those goods come back to us in final assembled product. These block of three countries, they export $4 trillion compared to our $1.5 trillion. So, if you look at American exports, it really looks like a 19th century economy. Other than our main exports to China, like junk paper, scrap steel, scrap plastic, we also are heavy agriculture country. We do soybeans and corn. So really, what's propping up this American GDP number? It's all government spending and private consumption. We've now moved the private consumption to 72% of our GDP number. So the main point of my article here is that as long as we're going through this money printing system and we're trying to push up the GDP number, it's not going to help jobs. We've had jobless recoveries for 10 years going now, jobless recovery after jobless recovery. We have 330 million people in the country now, 30 million more people than we had 10 years ago. We have less people working, yet our GDP has grown pretty sizable over the last 10 years. So you can see this is really pushing on a string, this whole Keynesian economics and quantitative easing. It's not going to result in any new jobs, and a focus on something as simple as the GDP number is no longer really applicable in measuring the health of the economy.
All right, now the GDP number, and I want to talk about two different things. First of all, on that GDP number, of course, the published number is the gross calculations based on the components you just mentioned, minus the deflator, which is tied to CPI and inflation. And the way you get a positive GDP, of course, is by understating that CPI and inflation. That CPI number doesn't include things like food and energy, for example. So just the number itself is miscalculated, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you just go through every statistic in the United States, we miscalculate it. retail spending, if it's up 1% this year, that could just be price increase. We don't factor in inflation at all in that. So yeah, we can continue to report higher numbers, but actually have less results.
Now, as you also mentioned, 70% of the GDP is consumption. Consumption is driven primarily by people going into debt, and that debt comes primarily from America's biggest creditor, China, who also is the person selling American all the stuff that they consume. So there's a bit of a symbiotic relationship between the two countries. America's fake GDP. Can we also say that therefore China has a fake output as well?
Absolutely. China and the United States are caught up in this two-step of a completely globally unbalanced economy. China's really the mirror image, way too much fixed asset investment, currency's too low, overcapacity in industry after industry. So yeah, absolutely. Although if I was to ask myself which position would I rather be in, I'd obviously want to be in China's shoes, because I think it's a lot easier to get them to restructure their economy by buying more of their outputs, as opposed to the United States, where we're going to have to tell 106 million people who are currently on the welfare rolls, we're going to have to train them to go back to work and learn how to make something.
All right, so the argument is that China can boost the value of the yuan, which would give the Chinese people purchasing power to purchase the very stuff that they make. And of course, in doing so, they would sacrifice their huge US dollar holdings. But at some point, they're going to have to make that sacrifice, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't see, obviously I don't know what's going on in inner top policy circles in Beijing, but obviously I think their economists at this point have to realize that buying more treasuries is just throwing good money after bad. And I think we've seen that their treasury holdings have not increased in the last 2 to 3 years. That was probably one of the main things that drove the Federal Reserve to take those buys by China private and take them off the market. So they're not adding to treasury positions. They're buying, they're going on a merger and acquisition wave all across the world right now, mostly in Africa, South America, and Europe, but continuing more also in the United States.
Okay, so the strong yuan or Chinese currency policy is a response effectively to a collapsing dollar, but in fact, China seems to be going the opposite direction at the moment by lowering the reference, the value of the currency to continue to perpetuate this export-driven growth model, which is doing two things, of course. It's continuing Chinese GDP, but it's also effectively entrapping U.S. into these gargantuan debts. So, as you point out, they're in a bit of, I guess, remember the old Chinese finger torture traps. You put two fingers in both sides and you're stuck. We used to have those as a kid. But so it seems like these two countries, the two of the three biggest economies of the world, are stuck in this type of mutually either beneficial, but apparently more mutually destructive relationship. Your thoughts?
No, absolutely. China extracting itself from this position is going to be very, very difficult. It's probably just going to take several years, if not a decade, of just readjustment, rebalancing. I totally disagree with their currency policy. You're right to say they are even continuing to lower the value of the renminbi. I believe that's because there's a lot of people high up in the government that control export businesses, and that's why they want to keep the RMB low. In terms of the economic arguments to keep the RMB low, I believe they've absolutely unbalanced their economy by keeping it too low for too long. You look at the factories here; they literally can't find direct labor. Direct workers now in factories make more than people with college educations. And on the other side, the people that are working in the service industries, the college graduates, they can't find jobs because every job's in a factory. So the economy here is completely unbalanced. There's a lot of economists that have argued for China. It's in their best interest to let it appreciate, take off a lot of pressure of imported oil and imported ore and all these other imported materials. But so far, the last several years, they have not followed that. They continue to keep the RMB too low and even make it weaker.
All right, Dan Collins, over the past year, you've been a bull on China, the China story. And over that past year, the Chinese economy has been doing, the growth rate has come down by various measures. And now there's a lot of folks out there that are looking at this China story and and are anticipating more slowdowns going forward. Are you maintaining your bullish position that you had on 6 to 12 months ago, or have you tempered that at all, Dan?
Well, Max, I've been a bull on China for 15 years now. I've seen the growth. I've seen the development. Are we slowing down? I think last time I was on the show, I did say we are slowing down. No doubt about it. I go to a lot of companies in Zhejiang province. I know companies that their business is down 30 to 50%. Now, these guys are focused on the kind of asset investment type, steel type businesses. So these guys are really hurting. There's a lot of downsides in the U.S. in the Chinese economy right now. I don't believe they're actually growing at all this year. It's probably flat. But what I've pointed out before is the downturn is an engineered slowdown. There's no problems with creating demand. They actually have to shut off demand, put in policies to control prices of property, control people buying vehicles. I've mentioned before, if you want a license plate in Shanghai now, you pay $10,000 cash up front before you even buy the car. And then you buy the car with cash. So they've engineered a slowdown. They want to slow down. Is it getting too weak? It might be. I think now is the time. The local governments have put in massive stimulus measures. This is in the last few weeks. This has not been highly reported. But you see Ningbo, Hangzhou, these cities are putting in billion-dollar stimulus projects without listening to Beijing. Beijing still has a 9% commercial interest rate loan status if you can get a loan. So they've really choked off the economy here. Guizhou province just reported a $400 billion stimulus project. So the local governments here are getting out ahead of it. They have the money. There's a lot of capital here, and they're going to spend it. So China's absolutely slowing down. It's not growing. Long term, it's not. But my argument would be it's not structurally completely flawed at this point. There are industries that have too much capacity, like steel's one. But in general, they're not running a huge debt and credit Ponzi scheme like the American economy. So in terms of safe haven, I still like China long term.
Right now, another way to view the global economy is to look at price signals generated by various commodities. And we know about the famous role played by Dr. Copper. Copper is a commodity that tends to telegraph economic moves up and down. A few years ago, copper was booming, making new all-time highs, and the story is China had huge demand. They were stockpiling copper, and they were anticipating their growth rate to continue. Now the copper price is trending down. It looks like it's about ready to break some long-term support, which would indicate some really sizable weakness going forward. Again, driven primarily by what you're talking about here in China. Now, my next question is really more, cultural and as well as economics. You have a transition in China to this market-driven economy that promise prosperity for all type of, or to be glorious is to be rich. This type of idea that people should pursue profits, they should pursue wealth. And this was a huge transition from an economy that was governed by the idea of, more of the iron rice bowl, that everybody was guaranteed, some sustenance. But as we head into this downturn now, which would be the first, it could be the first major downturn of the post-China capitalist / communist story, are the people in China themselves braced for yet another change in the story, I guess you could call it?
Yeah, it'll be interesting. I think I've also mentioned before, I think eventually China will become a democracy. I think it's evolved to that point where people are kind of getting tired, where they can't even vote for anything. So that'll eventually transition over the next 10 years, I think. But in terms of, future economic troubles, I think China's pretty well prepared. You have to look at where they come from. People in their 50s here literally grew up hungry, didn't have enough to eat. So people here in Chinese, we say eating bitterness. They've ate bitterness all through the 60s, 70s, and most of the 80s. They had a very, very hard life. Prosperity has only really happened within the last 5 to 10 years. And that's probably only really for 30, 40% of the population. The older generations still live very frugal lives. They can live on $100 a month. So I mean, China's not new to adversity. So I see their transition. If we go into real severe economic problems globally, I see them being able to ride this out. They have the factories, they have the engineers, they're used they're used to hard times. Whereas America is going to be in for a real wake up call when you get all the the everybody gets a trophy generation having to really get through these hard times that are coming up.
All right, let's talk about food prices. Food prices around the world are once again rising sharply due to drought and extreme weather, and which seems to be happening more and more frequently. And this is happening in America with the corn, of course, and we're seeing this affect wheat in places like Russia. The food prices, the rice crop in the rice producing nations seems to be the least affected so far, from what I gather. But what kind of, how sensitive is China to, let's say, price of food were to skyrocket suddenly? I guess that, are they prepared for that type of thing, or what are your thoughts?
I don't see China. The price of food in China is very, very politically driven issue. We've lived through here 5 to 10 years of rapid escalating food prices, and that's really, I think, due to the huge money printing that's gone on all over the world, but especially also in China. China's used to 20% increases in vegetable prices every year. Oil prices up 20% every year. They're absolutely have to watch out for this issue. I don't see an Arab Spring type issue in China for food prices. China has the exports and has the money. They can buy the food on the market. If it comes down to countries, in poor areas of the world competing against China to buy food, China's got the money to buy it. So definitely they need to look out for it, but I don't see it as a Arab Spring type issue for China at this point.
All right, here's a very interesting story. Recently, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton was in Africa, and she warned leaders against China's investments in the region, suggesting that China was just grabbing their resources. Your thoughts?
Well, it's quite comical. I know I've met many people here in China from Africa. You go down to Guangzhou now, there's over 50,000 Africans living there permanently. They're doing trade there every day. They're exporting mobile phones. They're exporting small dry goods. China has really become the new, imperial power in Africa in many ways. Every country in Africa building sports stadiums, schools, hospitals. Are they getting resources? Absolutely. But, I think most of the African countries, if you talk to the people themselves, they're glad somebody's there to buy the materials, develop the mines. And there's a lot of two-way agreements between the countries in Africa and China on what they get in return. So, in my opinion, Hillary Clinton's position on this is totally unfounded. I think there's some new books out now about the China trade in Africa. It's actually benefiting greatly for the continent.
All right, Dan Collins, looking at the recent history in the Middle East and the military buildup in the Pacific, it seems like the U.S. primary objective in the Middle East is to box China out from having access to oil in the Middle East, because the U.S. would like China to remain a low-cost labor entity, but that's it. So energy, of course, is needed to grow. What is China doing in terms of developing some energy sources, since the U.S. has really taken such an aggressive stand to try to keep them out of the Middle East?
Yeah, unfortunately, from a geopolitical standpoint, China is boxed in through the South China Sea. You have on their east coast, you have Japan, you have the Philippines, you have Australia. You see, United States has worked with all these countries in the last several years. We now have troops in Australia. This is the new whole Pivot Asia strategy, try to box them in. China countered last week with reinforcing the military garrison directly in the South China Sea, which is not far from the Philippines. So these tensions are definitely ratcheting up. Geopolitically today, the American Navy is too strong for China to develop any response. So I think they do it economically. China's focused on growing economically, growing peacefully. China hasn't started a war with anybody since the 70s. How many wars has the United States been in since the 70s? So will they box him in? Yeah, absolutely. America's same strategy as Russia. We put up NATO bases ringing around Russia, despite the fact that at the end of the Cold War we said we weren't going to do that. We're now doing the same thing to China. The question for America is, do you really have the economic might to continue that kind of policy? You're going to ask the Soviets, you can continue to be a military power for decades after your economy crumbles and rots, but eventually it just breaks apart.
So it sounds like a waiting game to try to have the U.S. punch itself out, and the economy in the U.S. seems as though it really can't support this type of global empire much longer, especially internally in the U.S. You have the complete breakdown of society, infrastructure, and institutions. So any thoughts in China now about what people on the street are saying in terms of, or do they think about it, timing in all of this? Do they look over at the U.S. and they see a country that's rapidly collapsing or slowly collapsing?
Well, I think right now they see opportunity. They kind of laugh at the price of property over there. I get asked all the time, "Hey, I'm going to help me buy some property in the United States. It's ridiculously cheap." It's almost laughable now if you go over to the United States. I was there last month, and it kind of reminds me of being in the Matrix and taking the blue pill. In only the United States can you go get a $500,000, $1 million home loan at 3% for 30 years, and get a car without paying anything down. The rest of the world, we pay cash or we pay significant down payments. So they're living in United States, unfortunately, is in a bubble right now. When that pops, I don't think China realizes, I don't think the people here realize the severity, and I think that goes for Europeans as well. They don't have that much experience in the United States. I'm originally from Detroit, and I've seen it happen there, and it wrecked my home state. Now it's going all over the country.
All right, Dan Collins, we're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time. Thanks so much for being on The Edge.
Thanks a lot, Max.
All right, that's going to do it for this edition of On the Edge with me, Max Kesier. I want to thank my guest, Dan Collins. If you'd like to send me an email, please do so at ontheedge@presstv.com. Until next time, Max Kesier saying bye, y'all.